Dreams. We finally made it to the section on dreams. And here we go into dreams in this section and nightmares in the next one. And of course, we're going to start, as we've laid the foundation coming through, dreams themselves as far as what causes our brain to dream. And we're also going to get in here some of the hints as to what helps us remember them and why we forget almost all of them. Of all the dreams you have over the course of a night, some of them very short, very quick, you have a shot at remembering less than 1/100% of them because of how many are flying through. So let's hit first dream theories that we're going to talk about. Here's just the list of the 4 of them. They're just put up here in order of how many hits you're likely to get if you search Google for them. Activation synthesis theory, the most popular, but none of these are mutually exclusive. In any given study of clusters of dreams, any one of these can be true. In fact, we could take these and lay them into this kind of pattern where we say organization of knowledge and memories is an umbrella that explains all of these, and the others are a subset. So the organization of knowledge and memories is the system that allows or drives activation synthesis theory. We can say biological response to life circumstances is a subset under that, and the threat simulation theory is a subset under that. So these can all be related. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive at all. So let's start taking a look at some of these, but we have to start from the beginning. Don't worry, we won't hopefully take too long to get this one done. But when we talk about organizing knowledge and processing memory, how does the brain store our experiences? If you study memory in general psych, you get this idea of sensory store, short-term memory, long-term memory, as if the brain is moving the memories from place to place. Which raises the question, are our memories in a single place? Is my memory of grandma somewhere, or my memory of something that happened at the lake a couple years ago, is it stored in a particular place in the brain? So if I were to remove that spot, would I remove that memory? Now there's a hint here in cases where, especially in younger children, and in cases of severe epilepsy, where one hemisphere of the brain is becoming extremely damaged by seizure, and we can point to that hemisphere as being a problem and remove chunks, if not entire sections. You can look up a video called Brandy's Miracle about a girl, I believe she was 9 years old, who the majority of an entire hemisphere was removed. One of the things her parents were worried about, is she going to lose half her memories from that? Well, we couldn't verify that she lost any memories as a result of that. And how could that be? Does that mean they were all stored on the other half? But let's back up again and we got a little chart here of the brain. What we really want to pay attention to here is the hippocampus and the amygdala. You see they're very close together, not necessarily attached. The hippocampus is important in taking short-term memory, recent experience, and doing something called consolidation, which means strengthening it so that it has a chance to become a long-term memory. No memories are stored in the hippocampus. We can remove your hippocampus and all your memories are intact. But if we remove it, you will have something called anterograde amnesia, and you will never lay down a new memory. As soon as a certain experience has ended, or you turn your attention to something, you will have completely forgotten what you were doing just moments before. So that's a big one. The amygdala, you will hear in one of the documentaries we're going to watch later, they say the amygdala specializes in negative emotion. That's kind of an overgeneralization. The amygdala is involved in any strong emotion, whether that's positive or negative. And we're going to find when it comes to your ability to remember dreams, and we've mentioned this before, we'll mention this again, a dream has to last a certain length of time so you have a chance to remember it. It usually needs to have some sort of plot or consistent theme to it, but a real key is it needs to generate emotion of some kind, a feeling of some kind that comes with it. And that's where the amygdala triggers in here. Even then, you may not remember it. But if you have those three components, it lasted long enough, had some sort of consistent plot to it, had some sort of emotion that came with it, you have a better chance of remembering it. And as we'll note here in a moment, REM sleep is the one where the amygdala is most likely to be active. So REM dreams are the ones where you're most likely to be able to remember them. Now the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, here's where we're getting into impulse control, decision making. This is where we consciously direct thought. Those areas aren't as functional in dreaming, which is why dreams can be completely illogical, defy reality, defy physics. But let's come down to the point of the neuron here for a moment. The individual brain cell, which can actually grow multiple connections to other cells. They communicate with each other. Now, we don't want to go too deep into this, but any given neuron can have thousands of connections to other neurons. And anytime this one fires, its firing may trigger firing along one pathway. Another time it fires as part of another process, it may not cause firing along that pathway. It may cause firing in a different branch. And this is where we get into the idea of neural pathways, which means collections of neurons firing together. So if I have that one neuron, it can be a member of multiple neural pathways coming across. I may be remembering a trip to the beach I took 5 years ago. This neuron is part of a series of pathways that fire with that. I may be remembering something completely unrelated, like what I had for breakfast 2 weeks ago. This neuron happens to be part of a different pathway that fires with that. Brain is very interconnected in that way. Even neural pathways, and here is a picture of what we call a brain bow. What this represents are neurons that fire together. So every one of those strands you see in there of particular colors, they represent literally millions of neurons that in some given process are all firing together as part of that process. And this is where it gets really complex, even more so than the individual neuron. I can have a series of neurons firing together as part of one process, say a certain memory coming up. That individual pathway may also fire with other memories. I can get a lot of mixture of pathways in here. So this is kind of setting up the idea that what a memory is the synchronous firing of multiple pathways at the moment you are learning something. So let's say that I have some memory from a particular day that stands out. Let's say I saw a car accident down the block from my house. As I witnessed that, the neurons and the neural pathways that were firing off at that moment kind of fired together and formed that memory, held on to it. I probably had a strong amygdala reaction to that too, which is going to go along with that. When I go to sleep that night, one of the things that's happening is the hippocampus, in association with some of the deeper brainstem areas, including the pons, are sending signals up, kind of refiring a lot of those pathways that fired together, kind of rehearsing them, solidifying them together to make it more likely that I will remember the event later. So a whole bunch of pathways all over the brain firing at the moment I had the experience. That collection becomes that memory. In class, I often equate memory, and I believe we mentioned this earlier, to a Lego sculpture. Put a bunch of Legos together and make a particular sculpture out of it. The brain essentially takes those pieces apart, puts them away. Later, I want to recall it, and I start pulling pieces out and putting it back together. Once I get that together sufficiently that it's getting close to the structure, that causes the whole thing to fire off, and I'll remember it. And here's the other problem, though, with that. My confidence in my memory doesn't really connect with how accurate I am putting it back together. It's how many pieces I used in putting it back together. So the more pathways involved in recall, the more certain you feel of it. And this is where things get tricky, because when you recall things later, you basically reactivate that process. If I recall something wrong, a piece of something wrong, hippocampus, as it's rehearsing that, is going to integrate that wrong component into it. And I won't know that happened. Brain doesn't save old versions of memories to compare them with a new one and let me know something has changed. So any single pathway can be involved in a lot. That's why this last bullet on this slide says when enough pathways are triggered, they can start to cue a memory. And what I mean by background noise is as you are consciously having an experience, say you're sitting in class or talking to friends, things that are happening are causing pathways to fire off. Sometimes some of those pathways that fire off together are part of a synchronous firing that was part of another memory, and them firing together makes that other memory want to fire off. The reason it doesn't is because you're maintaining conscious control on what you're paying attention to. So when I say background noise, those are kind of like intrusive sidebar thoughts that are trying to pop in while you're trying to maintain focus on something else. If you don't try to maintain that focus and you just let these things run, that's where what we call stream of consciousness, either thinking or daydreaming, where you're basically just going from one thing to the next. If you've ever gone through a thought process where you're just daydreaming and you start thinking about one thing, and 15 minutes later, you seem to have gone, I went from this to something else to something else. 15 minutes later, I'm on a thought process that's not related at all to this one. How did I get there? You got there by just one thing you were thinking about causing some random firings, like branches coming off, and one of those branches fired off powerfully enough that you started following that one. And again, they can be relatively unrelated. So let's say I spent my evening trying to memorize a list of words, and while I'm sleeping, my brain is processing the memory of those. But during that processing, it's firing off enough pathways that some of them, seemingly unrelated to what I was trying to remember, fire off something else, and you go in that direction. And this is where it's really important that the frontal lobes aren't working that powerfully during sleep. That's what keeps you directed. So the brain is literally, when you're dreaming, not just a stream of consciousness experience, but we could put a real life kind of parallel on here. It's a little bit like the cognition of being schizophrenic, in which you go from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, and you have little control over where that pathway goes. Unless you're experiencing lucid dreaming, in which case you do have a degree of control there. We'll talk about lucid dreaming in a later section here, and how although you have conscious self-awareness that you're dreaming, you don't necessarily have complete control over all the elements of the dream. So the activation synthesis theory, very simply, stimulation that the brain is creating causes these pathways to fire off and create a conscious experience of some kind. And some of them are just partially firing, not enough to cue it up. That creates kind of that background noise in there. So sometimes, such as tip of the tongue phenomena, where you're trying to remember something and you can't pull it in. That's where some of the pathways in recall are firing off. You're getting a lot firing off. So you can feel the answer, but not enough are firing to have conscious awareness and recall of the thing you're looking at. Another example is if someone's trying to remind me of an event that I was part of, like say someone's trying to remind me of a wedding I was at 20 years ago, and they start describing it to me. One of the things my very creative brain is doing is creating a visual based on their description. While it's creating that visual, it's trying to cause a firing of pathways that may be associated with that. So if the visual that I'm creating from what they're telling me causes enough of those original pathways to start firing off, I may get a bam, and all of a sudden here comes the memory of it. And this is where we won't get into it here, but if you study psych in the memory section, you'll get into that. This is what can lead to false memory production, because you create a visual. If it spurs the memory, then bam, the memory pops in. If it doesn't, you may store the memory of that visual, and it can be confused later for an actual memory. So threat simulation theory, this is where we're actually going to get more into nightmares on this one later. This is the idea that dreams, at least some dreams, prepare us for facing real life challenges. And one of the nightmare theories we'll get into later is this one. Now keep in mind, a lot of dreams are just random things that you're picking up as part of processing. But every once in a while, some real life event will cause one of these paths to be followed there. For example, if you have a class presentation coming up in a couple days and you are an anxious public speaker, guaranteed you're going to have nightmares about it. And why I say nightmare is it's really rare for people to have dreams about something upcoming that's anxiety provoking where it turns out great. It's usually you have dreams about it and things go wrong. Nightmare theory would say, and we'll go into this in more detail later, that is preparing you for that outcome. So by having the dream of the bad outcome, you will, in your waking life, prepare more to prevent that bad outcome from happening. And we'll get into that in more detail later. The reason fictional stuff can get in, weird fictional stuff can get into these, like in what way is the alien UFO firing lasers and releasing fire-breathing dragons preparing me for any real-world event? While your brain is dreaming, it's pulling up stored data just wherever it can find it. It's not selecting stuff that is necessarily real-world stuff. So all of the fiction and media you were exposed to that you've remembered, that's part of that database that the brain pulls up. It doesn't know and doesn't care that that stuff wasn't real world. It just knows that it's stored in memory. And then again, a broader version of that, the biological response to life circumstances. In a nutshell, this is saying that things that happen in your day-to-day life will influence what gets into your dreams. If, say for example, you had a friend send you a friend request on Facebook, or an acquaintance that you haven't talked to in 10 years, you hadn't thought about them at all, then all of a sudden they're sending you a friend request and you accept it. That may cause that friend to pop into a dream you're having that night because it's something new that was stimulating when it happened. If you move or get fired or get a new job, anything happening, going on in your life that produces an emotional response or a change in mood or feeling is likely to cause related dream activity. If you've been playing a video game, and this doesn't necessarily fall under this one, but if you've been playing a video game all evening and you just immediately go to bed and lie down, you may notice you're having video game imagery all over, very rapidly popping through your head right there. Because as the brain heads off to sleep, one of the first things it starts processing is the most recent thing that's happened to you. So overall, the organization of knowledge and memory, and this is where we get into the memory processing part, that one of the things the brain is doing is exercising and rehearsing things that happen to you during the day. It's reinforcing the ones that seem important, and it's not reinforcing the ones that don't, which means a lot of what goes on in your life day to day will not get encoded into long-term memory. It's grabbing important stuff there. And where this theory gets supported is that we find when you encounter sleep deprivation, impact on memory as far as processing and recall are impacted very quickly, and more so than any other function we see impacted by that. And we've hit this one a little bit already. Why can dreams be so weird? The one is prefrontal cortex is not putting any requirement on your dream to follow reality or follow physics or make any sense of the rules. And also, your dream is shifting sometimes in ways that make no sense. You may be dreaming about your home. In fact, the context of your dream is I'm at home, except none of the rooms in the house look like your home. None of it is applying. You go into a room and it's the same size of the room that it normally is, but there's a number of people in there that would be impossible to fit in that room. So physics doesn't apply in it. Normal, just linear memory doesn't apply to it. So things can get really wacky. And something in a dream that seems to make perfect sense will not make sense once you wake up. And the middle bullets here, that is one of the theories on why we forget dreams so quickly when we try to remember it. I wake up from a dream that had a whole bunch of nonsensical stuff to it. My frontal lobes are part of what's now trying to organize that so I can recite it, and you may have a problem with this with your dream journal. My frontal lobe is just finding pieces are falling off because they don't fit. There's no way to accurately describe them because they are so nonsensical, even though in the dream it may have made completely perfect sense. And in that last bullet there, we already mentioned that because the frontal lobes aren't really controlling what comes in, any stored information, any stored experience, which can be movies, TV, anything else, can get in and become dream elements, so they can get really bizarre in there. Now, do we dream more in certain stages of sleep? First bullet here, unknown, because here's one of the problems of dream research, and we'll mention this a couple more times. We can't plug into your head and record your dreams to see what you've actually dreamt during the night. We rely on your self-report, and you only self-report the ones you remember. But as we mentioned earlier, the firing of the amygdala is a big key into whether you have a chance of remembering it or not. The amygdala is more active in REM than in other areas of sleep. So it's not that dreams happen more in REM, but they're the ones you're more likely to remember. And a lot of this depends on how we're going to define what counts as a dream. That last bullet there, most dreams are short snippets. From the moment you fall asleep, your occipital lobe, visual cortex is still firing off, throwing little things at you. Auditory cortex may be firing off, throwing little things at you. That's why you may have hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations, where you hear something that kind of pops you awake. But those things are just flipping by. They make no sense. They're not connected in any way at all. So you could say your brain is dreaming all the time in every stage of sleep. It's just, most of it is just this cascade, this tsunami of really short images that don't last long enough for you to grab onto them. Again, it has to last long enough, have some sort of continuing story or plot to it, and must cause an emotion of some kind for you to have any chance of remembering it. Can dreams be a problem? Let's go back to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and what qualifies as something dysfunctional, and that is two key criteria that you have to have regardless of any other symptoms. Something causes you subjective distress and or gets in the way of functioning. Now, when it comes to dreams being a problem or sleep disorders, as we mentioned, we're basically talking about a problem that interrupts normal sleep and creates sleep deprivation. So if you're having dreams, more specifically here, nightmares, we touched on this in nightmare disorder, that are causing you problems in sleep, causing you emotional distress, again, according to the Diagnostic Manual for a clinical disorder, needs to be happening several times a week, needs to have been going on for at least 3 months, then you may be having a clinical problem. Okay. Now, do dreams mean something? Ooh, let's go there. We got a couple documentaries we have to hit here. Of course, when we're talking about dreams, we have to let Mr. Freud, yeah, come on in, ghost of Freud. We have to let Mr. Freud romp here. And the first one we're going to take a look at is interpretation of dreams. Also throws in some Freud biography on that. And the second one we're going to look at is dream research more on the sciencey side. So I'll meet you over there on the Freud documentary.